He was the face of American masculinity, a war hero on screen, a romantic icon in black and white, and the kind of man Hollywood built its legend around. But what if I told you that Burt Lancaster, one of the most celebrated actors of the 20th century, spent his entire life hiding a truth that could have destroyed him? At 80 years old, long after the cameras stopped rolling, Burt finally whispered the secret that Hollywood had buried for decades. A secret not just about who he loved, but how he lived. This is the story of the man behind the legend and the forbidden truths he carried to the grave. Before the fame, before the scandals, before the golden statues and whispered secrets, Burt Lancaster was just another kid running through the crowded streets of Harlem. Born in 1913 to a working-class Irish-American family, life didn't hand him much. His father worked for the Postal Service, his mother kept the household afloat, and every dollar mattered. But even as a child, there was something different about Burt. Not just in his striking looks or towering frame, but in the way he carried himself. He didn't walk like a boy growing up poor. He moved like someone who knew he'd escape it. Harlem in the early 20th century was a place of rhythm and grit. Jazz pouring out of open windows, street performers on every corner, and families trying to survive one hard year at a time. But Burt didn't follow the usual path of school, job, settle down. He was restless, hungry, drawn to movement and adrenaline like a moth to flame. He joined the Union Settlement, a community program that offered sports and physical training to local kids, and that's where he discovered his first true love, the circus. Not the glamour you'd imagine. We're talking real grit, acrobatics, sweat, bruises, balancing on bars for hours and risking bones for applause. Burt joined the K Brothers Circus as a teenager and toured the country doing trapeze. It was during these years, suspended 30 feet in the air, that he learned control over his body, over fear, and eventually over how the world saw him. Every performance was survival, every jump, a decision between failure and flight. That circus life didn't just give him muscles, it gave him myth. By the time Hollywood came calling, Burt wasn't just another pretty face. He was someone who knew how to perform under pressure. Someone who had already lived a dozen lives before the first frame ever rolled. But no amount of acrobatics could prepare him for what Hollywood would demand next. When Burt Lancaster finally landed in Hollywood, he was already a man molded by movement and sharpened by survival. Unlike most fresh faces arriving by bus or train with nothing but hope in their pockets, Burt came in like a force of nature. Over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and with the kind of jawline that looked sculpted by ambition itself, he didn't audition. He arrived. His big break came fast. In 1946, he starred in The Killers, a dark, brooding noir based on a Hemingway short story. And just like that, America was introduced to the Swede, a doomed ex-boxer caught in a web of betrayal. It wasn't just the physicality he brought to the role, it was the pain behind his eyes, the quiet rage that made you lean in. Overnight, he became a leading man, but not the kind studios were used to. Burt didn't just play characters, he inhabited them. While other actors stuck to type, cowboy, soldier, lover, Burt refused the box. He didn't want to be anyone's poster boy. And audiences felt it. They saw more than a handsome face. They saw a storm just under the surface, a man fighting something invisible and maybe, just maybe, something forbidden. His roles kept getting bigger. War epics, love stories, thrillers. But behind the camera, he was quietly observing, taking notes. Because while everyone else was chasing stardom, Burt had his eyes on something much riskier: control. And in the cutthroat world of post-war Hollywood, that was the one thing no actor was supposed to have. By the 1950s, Burt Lancaster wasn't just a movie star, he was a disruptor. While most actors clung to the safety of studio contracts, Burt did something nearly unthinkable. He built his own production company, Hecht Hill Lancaster. A bold move, especially at a time when Hollywood was ruled by iron-fisted studio executives who believed actors should speak lines, not make decisions. And he didn't stop there. In 1960, he took on Elmer Gantry, a fiery preacher who sells salvation like snake oil. Burt didn't just play the character, He exploded off the screen. Loud, magnetic, manipulative, but still strangely sympathetic. He won his first Academy Award, not just for acting, but for fearlessness. Because this wasn't a likable man. This was a man trying to be better, failing often, and exposing his soul in the process. 2 years later, he stunned critics again with Birdman of Alcatraz, playing real-life prisoner Robert Stroud. This time, the rage was internal. Caged, isolated, transformed by time and solitude. Burt delivered one of the quietest, most haunting performances of his career. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't charming, but it was unforgettable. Through each role, he kept proving one thing. He wasn't afraid of being uncomfortable, of looking broken, of showing weakness. And in a town obsessed with perfection, that kind of honesty was revolutionary. But for all his on-screen vulnerability, there was a part of Burt that remained guarded, a space he refused to open to the public, a truth too dangerous for the time. And while the world celebrated the characters he played, they had no idea who he really was when the lights went out. And while he spoke freely about public causes, his personal life remained locked behind an iron curtain. He didn't parade relationships. He didn't offer details. And in a town addicted to gossip, that silence only deepened the mystery. Some assumed it was ego. Others thought it was trauma. But the truth, the real truth, was far more complex. Because while Burt fought for justice out loud, he was hiding a secret that could have destroyed him. And when that secret finally came out, decades later, it would shock even his closest friends. For all the precision he brought to his performances, Burt Lancaster's love life was a storm. Unpredictable, intense, and often destructive. He married 3 times, but none of those relationships ever seemed to hold him down for long. His first wife, Yoon Ernst, was a fellow circus performer, strong, daring, and full of fire. They connected through the shared rhythm of the trapeze, but circus life is built on constant movement, and eventually, they drifted apart. The dates of their divorce are murky. No one seems to agree exactly when it ended, and maybe that's fitting because almost everything about Burt's personal life lived in the shadows. His second marriage to Norma Anderson seemed more stable. She wasn't from showbiz. She was an activist, sharp-minded, and politically driven. For a while, they were partners in more than marriage, fundraising for civil rights, challenging the establishment. They had 5 children and even set up a printing press in their home for Norma's advocacy work. But despite the shared ideals, their marriage fractured under the weight of fame, distance, and quiet emotional fractures. By 1969, it was over. And then came Jackie Bone, a hairstylist with a wild streak who met Burt on a film set. Their romance was everything the tabloids dreamed of: explosive, passionate, and utterly chaotic. At one Hollywood party, she famously smashed a wine bottle over his head during an argument in front of some of the industry's biggest names. That story made the rounds not because it was scandalous, but because it felt right for Burt. This was a man who didn't do anything halfway. Not love, not war, not even heartbreak. But what no one knew, not the press, not the fans, not even some of his closest collaborators, was that the real reason none of these relationships lasted might have had more to do with who he truly was inside. A part of him no woman could ever reach. Because while the world saw a ladies' man, a Hollywood tough guy, a romantic hero, Burt Lancaster was quietly living a life no one was supposed to know about. And in the final years of his life, he finally let the truth slip, one piece at a time. He was 80 years old when he began to speak the unspoken. In quiet, reflective moments with close friends, and only after decades of silence, Burt Lancaster started to reveal the truth he had carried his entire adult life. That many of his deepest, most meaningful relationships weren't with the glamorous women he was linked to in magazines, but with men. Men the public knew. Men whose names lit up marquees. Men whose secrets matched his own. The first name he whispered? Cary Grant. It was the late 1940s when they met, both at the height of their fame. Cary with his impeccable suits and clipped English charm. Burt with his stormy presence and circus scars hidden beneath his tuxedo. Their connection was instant but fragile. built on moments stolen behind closed doors and whispers exchanged at secluded beach houses along the Pacific coast. But Carey was careful. Too careful. He feared scandal more than he craved love, and when things grew too intense, he walked away. Burt never blamed him. He just called it one of the few times in life he felt truly seen, even if only for a while. The next name, J. Edgar Hoover. Not an actor, but easily one of the most powerful and most paranoid men in America. Their relationship was never romantic in the traditional sense. It was steeped in secrecy, control, and something almost dangerous. Hoover, a man obsessed with appearances, kept a watchful eye on Hollywood, and perhaps saw in Burt a kind of kinship or threat. Burt later described their dynamic as an intimacy that never knew daylight. Their connection faded as Hoover's grip on power deepened, but it left a mark, a strange, unresolved memory of two men trapped by their own mythologies. And then came Rock Hudson, the golden boy of American cinema, clean-cut, charming, and deeply closeted. He and Burt met in the early 1950s, both stars, both hiding. Their romance was more than a fling. They shared long desert getaways far from photographers and fan magazines. Rock lived in constant fear. Fear of discovery, fear of being outed, fear of the disease that would one day reveal everything. Burt spoke of Rock with quiet sadness, as someone who wanted to love, but never felt allowed. Their relationship ended not with betrayal, but with resignation. The world wasn't ready. And then came Ricky Nelson, the boyish heartthrob nearly 2 decades Burt's junior. Their connection was brief but tender. Ricky was searching for his identity in an industry that only saw him as a brand. Burt became a mentor, a protector. But even he knew the timing was wrong. Ricky wasn't ready. The world wasn't ready. Burt gently let him go. The last, and perhaps most complicated, was Marlon Brando. Where Burt was disciplined, Marlon was chaos. Where Burt was controlled, Marlon lived in extremes. Their chemistry was electric. Debates turned to flirtation, arguments to something more primal. They burned fast and bright. But 2 stars of that magnitude, carrying secrets that heavy, couldn't survive in orbit together for long. Burt once said, "Marlon was the only man who could pull me into a storm and make me thank him for the wreckage." These relationships weren't rumors. They were revelations, shared in quiet confessions near the end of his life. Not to shock, not to be remembered differently, but to finally be known. Truthfully, painfully, and completely. Because for Burt Lancaster, the real performance wasn't on camera. It was the act of hiding who he was for an entire lifetime. Today, we remember Burt Lancaster for the roles: the soldier drenched in waves, the preacher ablaze with fire, the prisoner cradling birds in a lonely cell. We remember the Oscars, the iconic scenes, the searing intensity that made every performance feel like it was being etched into the screen in real time. But that's only part of the story. What made Burt different, what made him unforgettable, was what we didn't see. The courage it took to go against the system. The strength to challenge the studios when no one else dared. The willingness to fund stories about real people instead of chasing another blockbuster. And maybe most of all, the quiet resilience of living with a truth he couldn't share, and still finding a way to love, to connect, to fight for something bigger than himself. His legacy isn't just cinematic, it's human. He showed us that masculinity could be vulnerable. That power didn't have to mean silence. That art wasn't about pretending, it was about revealing. And when the final credits rolled on Burt Lancaster's life, he didn't just leave behind a filmography. He left behind a reminder that even legends have secrets, even icons have fears, and even the strongest among us are just trying to be seen for who they really are. Because Burt Lancaster didn't just play heroes. In his own quiet, conflicted way, he was one. So now you know. Behind the dazzling smile, behind the Oscars, behind the iconic roles that defined a generation, was a man who carried more than scripts. He carried secrets, longings, a heart that beat loudly in silence. Burt Lancaster wasn't just a product of Hollywood. He was its contradiction. A rebel in a tuxedo. A fighter with a poet's soul. He played roles that demanded attention and lived a life that demanded restraint. And yet, somehow, he still managed to leave behind a legacy that speaks louder now than it ever could back then. Not because he was perfect, but because he was real. He reminds us that the people we see on screen, the legends, the icons, the giants, are more than images. They're human, messy, brilliant, broken, brave. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is carry a truth they're not allowed to speak, and still live with love anyway. So here's the question. Which part of Burt Lancaster's story surprised you most? Was it the secret romances, the political defiance, the creative rebellion? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. And if you found yourself caught in the story, if it made you think twice about the people behind the camera, hit that subscribe button, because this is only the beginning. We've got more legends to uncover, more myths to unravel, and more truths that Hollywood never wanted you to hear. Thanks for watching. And remember, the real story always lives between the lines.